How can I know God is real? It's an important question, isn't it? Maybe you're watching today because of your curiosity around that question. How can we know? Among the vast array of things that we're called on to believe in today's world, why should we give any more credit to the claims of the Christian faith above others? I'm reminded of the NRL Grand Final in 2015. It was a tie full-time between the Broncos and the Cowboys because of a last-minute try, and Jonathan Thurston had the job of converting the try. Tensions were running high. The crowd was on their feet. The coaches were nervous. Thurston took his time to set up the goal. He kicked, finally. It was looking good, very good. But at the last minute, it curved and hit the goalpost. No conversion. Scores still 16 all at full time. The game went in then to extra time. Now, why am I telling you this? Because of what one of the Channel 9 commentators had to say about that. They were heard to say just afterwards, sometime or other, I would like to interview the football gods and ask them why they didn't allow Jonathan Thurston to have his moment of glory and convert that try. And I thought to myself, really? There are football gods? No one ever told me that before. How can we know that there's any more credibility to the Channel 9 commentators' football gods who apparently look after who converts tries and the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ? How can we know God is real? And what I'm going to say may seem as surprising or as incredible as football gods, but here's how I know God is real. Because he turned up here in person, in the person of Jesus Christ in the first century. I have no evidence that there are football gods controlling the outcome of conversions of tries, but I can point you to loads of historical evidence that Jesus Christ, who walked this planet, was God turned up in a person. I have 4 significant things to point out from the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, which Wendy read for us. Luke is one of 4 biographies that we have, historical documents that are biographies of Jesus. And I want to point out from that introduction alone that Christianity is biographical, it's historical, it's biblical, and it's personal. So first of all, Christianity is biographical. The whole Christian faith rests on the birth, life, teaching, miracles, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus Christ. Have another look with me at some of what we read. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. And then the author adds in verse 3, I too decided to write an orderly account for you. See, there have been other accounts that the author acknowledges of the life of Jesus, but he is saying that on the basis of his personal investigations with eyewitnesses, that he decided to write his own orderly account. Christianity is really unusual among the world religions in that it revolves around a person. Compare that to other religions. Hinduism doesn't revolve around a person at all. In fact, there are many gods, so there's no focus on any particular god. Hinduism is about eternal wisdom. Or take Islam. If you were here 2 weeks ago, we saw that Islam means submission. Islam is not about a person, but about the proper way to submit to Allah. Or Buddhism, it might seem at first that it's about someone called Buddha, but he famously told people not to attach themselves to him. He's only like a boat taking them onto the other side. Jesus, however, says, no, attach yourself to me, depend on me, enter a relationship with me based on trust and love. It couldn't be more the opposite. So that's why Christianity is unlike any other religion, and our founding texts are not books of law or philosophy or mystery or ritual. They are biographies about Jesus. Susan and I have a friend in Vancouver in Canada, and she tells the story of how she encountered Jesus somewhere on her second glass of wine and between chapters 1 and 2 of John's Gospel. And now she's a huge fan and a devoted follower. She read Jesus' biography and was convinced from early on. And I hope that you're here watching this today because this question is of interest to you about how can I know God is real. Maybe someone's invited you to watch. I hope that you might start with a cup of something or a glass of something that you like to drink and a session or two reading one of the biographies of Jesus, because you will meet him there. First and foremost then, Christianity is biographical. Secondly, it's historical. Let's go back again to the words from our introduction. Many have undertaken to draw up an account, that word refers to history, of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses. That's another historical term. Therefore, verse 3, since I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, more historical terms. This is history the author is writing. That's what he claims from the outset. It's not invented, it's not created, it's not made up. Let me show you just a little later in the Gospel how precise the history is, how he wants to set Jesus firmly in the historical context of the time. So this is what he says in chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, we know exactly when and where that is, when and where he ruled. When Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod Tetrarch of Galilee. We know exactly where that is also and who he is. His brother Philip, Tetrarch of Iturea, and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene. We know all about these characters and places from other historical secular documents. So what I want to point out here is that there is no way the story of Jesus was ever meant to be read as a legend or a parable or a metaphor or some sort of spiritual event that didn't take place in time and space. Now, the author ties the account of Jesus into a precise time and place. And the fact that Luke carefully researched those who were eyewitnesses tells us that his work was probably finished within 20 or 30 years of Jesus having been around. Otherwise, the eyewitnesses would have been dead. Now, this is fascinating when you compare it to other historical works, which no one ever thinks to question. For example, around Alexander the Great. He had a massive kingdom 3 centuries before Jesus. The first biographical account doesn't occur till 140 or 150 years after he was around. But the best account, the one that's considered the most significant, is by Arrian 400 years after Alexander is dead. Luke, by comparison, is so close to the events that he is personally aware of and knows and speaks to the eyewitnesses. Christianity is not based on a lone spiritual insight or a mystical story or a dictation to somebody under a tree. This is not once upon a time in a land far and far away stuff. It is based on historical events in real time, recorded by a multiplicity of witnesses close in time to the events. So Christianity is biographical, it is historical, and thirdly, it is biblical. Now, what do I mean by biblical? Simply this, that when Jesus turned up, the events that are described, that happened, are in what we call fulfillment of expectations. Fulfillment of expectations that are laid out very carefully in the first section of the Bible we call now the Old Testament. And there were things, events, times, places laid out there very carefully that are fulfilled, that came to pass, that happened just as in accord with expectations in the New Testament, in the life and times of Jesus Christ. Luke says, if you're recalling the introduction, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. He understands that the history of Jesus is part of a bigger story, a larger history. In fact, it fits with that first part of our Bibles we call the Old Testament. It's crucial to understand this. It's crucial to understand where Jesus fits in the big picture of God's scope and plans for the whole world. And you see this in different places throughout Luke's Gospel. For example, in Luke chapter 4, Jesus gets up to read or to give his first sermon, and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, which is one of the key Old Testament books. And he announces after he reads from the scroll that these words have been fulfilled, they've come to pass, they've come to be understood as happening as Jesus has spoken. At the end of the gospel, Jesus' last words to the disciples after his resurrection, he explains to them how his life fits with all that was spoken of in the Old Testament. And he says, what I told you when I was with you, that everything must be fulfilled about me that is written in the Old Testament. So you won't fully appreciate the story of Jesus until you get something of the backstory, if you like. Jesus turning up in the first century was part of God's grand plan to address the evil of the world, a plan that had so far been around 2,000 years in the making. So Jesus turning up is massive. It's the turning point of history. It's the centerpiece of God's plans. So Christianity is biographical, it's historical, it's biblical, and finally, it's personal. Did you know what Luke says in the opening verses to this guy named Theophilus? I've written this orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Now, we don't know who this Theophilus is. It wasn't uncommon to dedicate historical works to someone of note in the community. But note that Luke wants Theophilus to know the certainty of the things that he's been taught. He's just heard rumours about stuff. He's heard just the beginnings of the Jesus story. And now Luke wants him to know that this is for real. He wants him to have certainty. The particular word that Luke uses there means security and dependability and certainty and stability. Something of the thought that is really solid. In fact, we get our word asphalt from this word. So Luke wants Theophilus to know that there's something solid, dependable, certain about the account of Jesus he's going to unfold in his book. It's something that Theophilus can depend on and count on. It's for him. There may be some people here today, watching today, who have known very little about Jesus to this point. But you do have a hunch. There's more to life than meets the eye. More to life than the sum total of your wealth. More to life than what you've been able to achieve in your career. More to life than even your family. And you've heard a little bit about Jesus, but not a lot. Guess what? I want you to have certainty about those things that you have believed. I want you to know about Jesus. I want you to know it's for real. I remember early on in my time in Noosa, a gentleman asked me in a seminar that I was taking, do you mean to say, Mark, that Jesus was a real person who walked this earth? And I answered him kindly, absolutely, that's what I'm saying. Christianity is personal. It's for you. The biographies of Jesus were written for you. It will make a difference in your life. There's another story you might have heard me tell before about a couple in Noosa who had been in and out of church all their lives but hadn't really clicked with Jesus. But then when they began to understand how much God loved them, how real Jesus is, the historical dependability of the New Testament documents, when they began to understand God's kindness to them, when they began to understand that Christianity is not about what they must tick off to do to get to God, but how God has come to them, about what God has done for them in the person of Jesus Christ, you know what they said to me? Why hasn't anyone told me this before? I don't want you to get to the end of your life and say, well, why didn't anybody tell me about Jesus? I want you to know that the New Testament documents are historical, they're reliable, you can depend on them. And that when what we read there about Jesus is true, it happened, and that he is there for you. How can we know God is real? Because he turned up. And if Jesus is for real, if Jesus is God turned up in a person, that has to mean that he's a whole lot more important than most Australians give him credence for. I want you to be certain about him, and he wants you to be certain about him. Because if it's true that God has turned up, that's the most important piece of information we have to make sense of life here. If it's not true, then forget the whole thing. None of it matters. If it is true, everything matters. How do we know God is real? Because he turned up in the real person of Jesus Christ and really walked this planet 2,000 years ago. How do we know that? Because of the primary documents, the New Testament Gospels, which are biographical. They're about a person, the person of Jesus. Historical, They're from eyewitnesses, and they're grounded in historical places and times and places that we can validate from other historical sources. They are biblical, that is, they fit with the whole pattern of the Bible and God's plans and purposes from all of time. And they're personal. They're for you, that you may have certainty about Jesus, certainty about God, and connect with him, therefore, in a real and personal way. Will you test the history of Jesus? Will you at least be open to the possibility that this may be a lot more significant than you have currently considered so far? Will you consider taking my Jesus Explained course so that you can come and bring your doubts and questions Tuesdays in July, 4 p.m. or 7:15 p.m, and explore more about this with me? Oh, and if you've been convinced forever that God is real and that Jesus is God turned up in person, that's fantastic. You stay close to him and continue to build your life on that relationship with him that Jesus' coming has made possible. But I want to urge you, become more and more confident yourself in the historical nature and reliability of the New Testament documents, so that when somebody asks you, how can I know God is real? You can point them to Jesus, the best way we can know about the reality of God and his love for us. Amen.